Good morning, everyone. This is a recording of a class that I have taught a few times now, but I am recording it independently so that way I can upload it for easier access. My name is Lord Cassiano de Castello. I am from the Kingdom of Ethelmark, specifically the Shire of Nithgard, and this is a class about research and using different research techniques in the SCA to make your documentation more thorough or better, or to bulk it up. I specialize mundanely in I specialize in the SCA in apothecary and research. I work a lot with food types, specifically like cordials and alcoholic things that don't have extents. And when you don't work with an extent, your research topics can get a little hairy, and this class is structured around some of the techniques that I have used to get around some of the issues I've encountered. Mundanely, I am trained as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and I have experience in both laboratory and field research as well as more technical publication. So that background kind of informs what I do in the SCA. And you may be asking why I'm teaching such a chunky topic. And the reason why I'm teaching this is I kind of touched a little bit on this already, but I'll expand further. I came to the realization that I was using a lot of professional methods for my SCA research. And through the course of my schooling, I learned a lot of tools to navigate problems in research, such as what can I do when I've hit a roadblock, or my research is lacking context in this area, or I've hit a dead end, which are all problems that we encounter in our SCA projects as well. Furthermore, I was relying on my training for navigating useful but intimidating academic resources, or while I chased leads on information that I wanted to use. And I realized that I felt strongly that there needed to be a class where I could pass on this kind of information for others to use. And I felt this way because one of the reasons why I left academia was a number of reasons, but specifically I felt that there was a certain kind of gatekeeping involved in when you encounter new skills that you want to learn that are either practical or or available knowledge, that you kind of have to get in with the right group, and that frustrated with me. I sincerely believe that you do not need to have a university education or pay thousands of dollars to become a researcher or become a more effective researcher. So I structured this class to share what I think my strengths as a researcher are with you folks, so that you may take them and make them your own. Lastly, this class is geared towards anyone who might become frustrated enough to trash their project or break away from ANS completely, whether you are researching for the first time or at the Laurel level or somewhere in the middle like I am. I've heard folks who have gotten into ANS be ready to leave it after becoming frustrated or receiving feedback, and specifically feedback that they don't know how to move forward with, or that makes them feel that they want to get out of doing this kind of research because it's unhelpful. Hopefully this class can give you a new perspective to find a different avenue so you can get what you want out of your projects or move forward with them. Because ultimately this art is for your own growth and enjoyment, or at the very least, this class, I hope, should be able to give you a new framework to evaluate your current research with new eyes. And what I mean by framework is every argument needs a premise, and method and theory, you might have seen those words at the title slide. It's often one of those mandatory, scary classes you see in a course catalog for college. But what it means is this framework, or perhaps tools in a toolbox that you can use as you begin to ask research questions. We all have opinions about our research and our specialties, the kinds of arguments that we can make. But what turns those arguments into research questions is the structure that you give the argument. And this creates your premise for your research and gives grounding for your interpretation, which is important For example, I can have the opinion or the premise that all liquors in the SEA are honey-based, and that's an interpretation maybe I can take from research that I have done, but it needs framework and backing to either make it stand up or correct that assumption. For ultimately, these questions should be turned into plausible explanations. The tools later described in this class should help with this regard. So what we're going to do here is look at 4 sets of questions. Each set of questions that we can ask, each of these sets of questions that we can ask wants us to consider a specific point of view about any generic research topic. I'm not going to be reading you guys theory textbooks for this. It wouldn't be a good time for anyone. So instead, we're going to consider an object and talk about it within the framework of the question set. You may notice as we go through these sets of questions that they may argue with each other, and that's okay. A lot of these schools of thought evolved in opposition in opposition to or alongside each other, and that kind of call and response of theory or critiquing is really common in academia. In some ways, these sets of questions will counter or enhance each other, but they all have valid viewpoints, and none of them are correct or wrong per se. But like any perspective, they have their own limitations, and that's why we are looking at several of these sets rather than just one. So, starting with our first set of questions. The image on the slide is the Baumgartner altarpiece created by Albrecht Dürer within the latter part of the SEA period in 1500, and we're going to consider the set on the left first. For the first set, it really wants us to consider the overarching structures that created this art piece. And so Dürer was an artist who was not only a painter, but also famous largely for his woodcuts and his role in the mass printing of art. And we want to first start beyond the artist and look at the period that he was working in. So, for example, consider the wider cultures that inform the art piece, such as the religion of the times, which in this case is Northern German Catholicism. What can we ask about the underpinnings of this religion, and how might they differ from, say, Spanish or Italian expressions of Catholicism? How then does this art piece fit into the larger German Catholic traditions? Is perhaps a question we might then ask. We should also consider the language, in this case German, and how that might inform, or I suppose more than the language, the larger social context of German society, and how might this inform this altarpiece differently than, say, if it was Italian or Spanish? We should also consider this other lovely German word, the Zeitgeist, or the time period that this art piece came from. This is a Northern Renaissance art piece, and we can then ask, what does this object have in common or differ from other Northern Renaissance art pieces of its time? Perhaps other altarpieces. Are there any aspects of this altarpiece when compared to others of its time period? Do they have certain themes in common, certain structures? And could we even consider those to be universal themes that always show up in art pieces of this type? And I kind of just threw a lot of questions at you, but these are all, what we're trying to look at here is the comparison of this specific piece into a larger framework that it might fit in, because ultimately what we're trying to do with this set of questions is categorize this art piece as, is it typical of the Northern Renaissance, or is it typical of German art? And really, this first set of questions is very much concerned with the broadest context within which we can place an object. So this is really good for background research. And I going back to that title slide, I've titled this course with this particular first set in mind, as a common critique of research projects that I've heard or even received has been, you need to flesh out or bulk up your background context. While all of these question sets will help you in this direction, these are of particular use in asking different or more thorough questions of your project. So now that we've considered the set on the left and, the questions that we can ask about structure. There is a second set, the set on the right, that we can ask about the object itself. As we consider the object itself, what we want to really look at here are things such as the movement that creates an artistic dialogue, or a period in time such as the Romantic period or the High Medieval period, right? These periods create a lot of different artworks, and if we consider the first set of questions, we can make the leap to say that all things that come out of, for example, the Northern Renaissance or the German Catholic artistic tradition are essentially the same, which then begs the question, is it fair to say that universally that all objects that come out of a specific period are the same? Which, you might say, of course not, but how then do you differentiate if you're trying to make effective comparisons? This second set of questions wants you to consider the object on its own rights, which is how we counterpoint that first set of questions. We don't want this set will stand in opposition to considering something as just a product of what has made it. As I wrote on the slide specifically, it wants you to consider the thing on its own merits, not just necessarily out of a larger artistic tradition. As I touched on in the introduction, Albrecht Dürer created this piece, so we can start with him, right? So we can ask questions of both his personal style, or perhaps did he belong to an artistic school that trained him? Can we ask too, is this a typical altarpiece of Dürer's style, or is it actually atypical of his body of work, and how can we discuss that? As I mentioned already, the second set really refines the questions asked by the first set. It doesn't want you to go too broadly into what you consider issue with my notes. It doesn't want you to go too broadly when you consider the argument you're trying to create. The first set of questions is truly helpful for those really broad structural questions, as it helps us plant our feet firmly in the known and branch out from there, right? But so as a lot of what we do as SEA reenactors is the recreation of things, and we may not necessarily know how they were made, so rooting ourselves in the larger knowns like the religion, the language of the time, the techniques used, those end up being really excellent starting points for how we begin our discussions. But we also need to realize that as we're trying to classify this object and as we are trying to talk about the artist, we have to be careful of overgeneralizing, even within the scope of the larger scale of Dürer's work. In that generalization, we have to be careful with these question sets to not introduce our own biases into the interpretation, even if we are specifically restricting ourselves to discussions of the questions such as the ones on the right, wherein we're restricting our frame of reference only to the artist. Interpretation does almost always introduce bias, as we are the ones with modern lenses looking into the past. And so when I say biases, and I do want to talk about biases here, apologies there for the recording flicker, it means something else here to a degree. And I want to begin with that it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we are, in general, as a people, conditioned to talking about bias in a purely negative fashion, and that's not necessarily the case. When we use bias in archaeology, there's another context of bias being your personal experiences and even skills that you use as a lens when evaluating an object. So if you're a seamstress or a weaver or a brewer, that body of experience and skill that you accrue over the course of learning ends up being a bias of its own kind, not necessarily, the bias of you've picked a side and now you stay there and everything is colored by where you stay. Right? Sort of like bias in argument. We're not necessarily talking about that here. And we can look at, returning to our point about education experience and personal skills as bias, we can look at that and say that's not definitely a bad thing and can be rather helpful, as experience does give you a firm footing to make inferences about whatever projects that you are working on. And I think that this is particularly important in the SEA because a lot of us come from the perspective of being experimental archaeologists and a lot of the things we recreate. And when we look at primary sources or research documents, we don't always, the folks who write those papers are very learned in their specific areas, but they may not necessarily have the practical experiences of construction or the making of the objects that they're talking about. Sometimes they do, and you should be on the lookout for that, but sometimes they don't. And for example, take the art piece on the left, which is, this is a portrait of the Grand Duchess Eleonora di Toledo de' Medici by Agnolo Bronzino. And this is relevant because I'm going to talk a little bit about my wife here, who is also in the SCA and has her grant of arms in costuming, specifically 16th century Italian corsetry and underwear, I think, if you would ask her. And when she used this, she was working on a dress for a competition and used this portrait as one of her resources to talk about how she constructed the garment. And in doing so, she drew on scholarly articles, like I mentioned prior, and an art history tradition to try to explain the construction of the dress beyond her own knowledge, or at least back up her own experience and knowledge. And as an individual with a fine arts and illustration background, combined with her knowledge of period garments, this seemed a good track to do at the time. However, she found herself disagreeing with some of the statements that were brought up in the scholarly tradition around these garments, particularly those of the Grand Duchess here. And she ultimately firmly disagreed with a number of the way these paintings were interpreted. And I'm just going to point out if you can see where the dress ends and her partlet begins, which is the net-like looking garment around her neck and shoulders, you can see something underneath, like at the edge of the slashing on the dress and the beginning of that net near her bust. You can see something kind of underneath that net. And this particular scholar indicated that she felt that the dress was lined with some sort of trim. And in the case of my wife's interpretation, as somebody who wears these dresses and works with these dresses, and I think actually many Scadians would agree with her that was most likely actually her chemise or her long undershirt, essentially the one-piece underwear that would be worn under this dress. And in this case, this doctor of Italian dressmaking and art history, Janet Cox-Rearick, her interpretation didn't stand up to the fundamental construction of the garment. And so that byplay there, in her ability to bring her being my wife, Fede, her ability to bring her background research and her own knowledge into a scholarly discussion of this painting and the dress allowed her to even correct certain assumptions made by those who perhaps don't necessarily work with these fabrics or work with the construction of the dress. Which, this is nothing to say anything against Janet Cox-Rearick. She's a titan in her field, for sure, and as well as that, an excellent writer. But we don't always, in archaeology and anthropology, it is kind of the curse of specializing that you don't necessarily have the full background to understand the totality of a piece. And it's kind of somewhat impossible to do that, unless, of course, you are Scadians, who seem to devote lifetimes to understanding a totality of the piece, which makes all of us fairly excellent resources to draw on, I would argue. A little biased there on my own part, I'm sure. That said, I would not necessarily recommend this level of confidence to argue with a scholarly resource unless you are quite sure. And in this case, Fede has 15 years of dressmaking experience to draw on and has her own journey and classwork that she talks about that allow her to feel confident enough to make these assumptions. That said, the ability to recognize the lenses that are presented to you from academic journals or from articles or other resources like historical monograph books, knowing the biases that an author has or a primary source has within their own presentation of the facts to you is a skill worth developing and utilizing. Being able to suss out the perspectives presented to you and then being able to, I suppose, see the cloth for the threads that make it, I guess, is a good way of putting it, will help you better assemble the threads of your own research into a whole piece. In the sum of all of this, archaeology is filled with stories like this, actually, where scholarship is corrected by people with functional knowledge. And so your ability as your own researcher to stand on your own grounds and your own experience, or see the gaps in research of those with more experience and how it's presented to you, it can actually be quite important. All right, let's end this interlude about bias and continue to look on about our second set of questions. In our discussion about the Baumgartner altarpiece, we discussed the questions we can ask of the people who created the objects. Now let's shift our focus to looking at the objects themselves. I'm going from top to bottom here. On this slide, there is a set of objects recovered from Birka, which is a Viking trading site in Sweden. And we have a set of brooches, bead strings, medallions, and a set of whalebone carved combs. The two big sets of questions that I want you to consider for this slide are with respect to people, not necessarily overarching structures. And there's a word that I want you to take away from this section called use life. And the use life of an object is defined as the moment that the object is conceived of and created to where it enters the place of sale and is purchased and is used until it is broken or discarded. The use life is a really excellent way of constructing a timeline to evaluate all of the hands that an object passes through from the moment it's created to the moment it's discarded. All of these hands, those that gathered the raw material, those that crafted it, those that purchased it and used it, are all perspectives in your research that you can use to fill in gaps or develop the richness of your historical background. It is also a very excellent truth sensing technique for the recreator, because if you look at all the hands that need to handle the material and handle the object, you can use it as a way to establish whether or not the method you're using to recreate it is grounded or, I suppose, correct. Because if in sort of the sense of if it takes too much time and too much effort and doesn't match necessarily how quickly something like this could be produced to hit the market, and thus make enough money for, say, if you were this crafter or harvester of raw materials, if you could not make enough money and make enough of these that your family could eat, there might be something off with your ability to reproduce this object quickly. Of course, there's always, skill and repetition involved in that, but it is a truth sensing technique nonetheless. Returning to our first set of questions and our discussion about how these objects get made, that method and complexity can also inform aspects of the object or facts and aspects about the object that may seem intangible, such as who might purchase this object. And knowing how an object, I know I keep saying object, but there's there's not really a better word. Artifact is after it comes after the ground, out of the ground, and has been discarded. So object is better than artifact because we are talking about it within its own lifetime of use, not after, it's been thrown away and us garbage pickers have found it. By garbage pickers, I mean archaeologists. But knowing how an object was used for the duration of its life can help you better understand the very people of the culture that inform it. So questions of, like, as I mentioned earlier, about what kind of person would buy this object, or for example, who would wear it, or even what the display of it might say about the person who is wearing it. Those are the kinds of questions where we start to get into aspects of social class and gender, or even the specific agency of the people who lived in the ancient past. And these are the kinds of questions that can really bring a culture, and by extension, your project, to life. If we're going to talk about the use life, if you imagine that the use life of the object is a timeline, like a string stretched out from end to end, and you can divide it up in segments between who created it and who used it, imagining what those lives might be, and then researching those sections of a string of the craftspeople, the folks who harvested raw materials, the overarching society that created the economic network to bring, the bone used in those combs from whale ivory to something used as an everyday household tool. That top-down view of the people as agents within an economic system really helps diversify the perspectives you can look at in your research. And it allows you to, I briefly talked about the ability to look at the totality of a single piece and to see the radiating points of, the lives of people who all put their hands on this object. And being able to see the totality of, if one of these medallions is the hub of a wheel, and the spokes coming off of it are all the different avenues, I suppose, of research you can take to understand that piece. That's a very diverse and extensive research project indeed, or even each spoke on its own is. And even too, say you're missing a spoke on that wheel. Say you can't say much about the folks who mined the gold used in the brooch, but you can about other things. Those are ways to help your research narrative stand up and stay with them. And that is kind of, one of the more beautiful things about archaeology, and assuredly the experimental archaeology of the SCA, is that our research really does give color and voice to the ancient past in a meaningful way. And we are 100% a piece of that research that, as I said in that side discussion about the totality of an object, that's a thing to flaunt that wholesale understanding of the period and the culture that your project is trying to recreate. So if you can tackle that, it's more than a very good start. For our third set of questions, it is somewhat of a combination of objects and people. If our first set was objects and our second set is people with our bias interlude. And it starts with the premise of, say, people A had a thing in SCA period, and it was documented that we know that they had the thing. And then say people B lived right next door to people A, but there's not really a lot of documentation of that people. Could we then say that by nature of proximity, did people B have the same thing that people A did? And it's an interesting, the answer is kind of maybe. But it's an interesting question that some scholarship says no to, but there is a way to go about this, especially if you're lacking in documentation and sources. If you use outside sources to look at culture, it's a lot like standing on the outside of a house and looking in through the windows. So you can see snapshots and glimpses, but it's not necessarily the full picture. Those snapshots, though, can be pieced together to make fairly reasonable assumptions if you have enough of them, or at least they can give you a perspective by which you can pursue them. To illustrate this, I have pulled up an image here of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at its greatest extent, roughly. This area, among others, is a significant blind spot in the eye of history for a number of reasons. The late adoption of Christianity in the region prevented oral traditions from being committed to paper. And as the traditional religion of the Lithuanians in the Grand Duchy was a Vedic tradition, which I mean fully oral, and it was the focal point of the Northern Crusades, as well as, future events of the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Wall, in research, they only supported research that would benefit, the Soviet narrative. All of these things combine together that there's an absolute dearth of primary sources, such as historical events, and that we hear about them vaguely from other people, but we can't talk about there's no voice for those people, or very little. Archaeology is only starting to make headway in this. There was a recent excavation of a village that showed the destruction layers from the Northern Crusades, and there's something there. They were able to say quite a bit about the space, but that destruction layer is fairly universal for that period. And you have stacking events like crusades or world wars or iron curtains or the destruction of smaller ethnic cultures for the sake of a larger, faux nationalistic identity. It makes period research in areas like this, very difficult. And this is not this is only one such area like this. And while I'm not saying that these things shouldn't be studied by the SCA, we do really have to be careful as a result of what we say and how we say it. And so the best example I can give of working with this, and I don't have any pictures for it on the slide, is my own research working with Krupnik, which is a honey liqueur that comes from this very area. During the pandemic last year, I was able to find several Rus sources that, and by Rus I mean old Russian area, or pre-Russian area, I guess, that referenced Lithuanian trade and production, which was really, really wonderful for my research. And, I got these little pieces of commentary, like how Lithuanian traders stunk of rye spirits, or were constantly being expelled for bootlegging or trading for booze in this area and being troublesome. And those little pieces of commentary, to borrow my earlier metaphor, the glimpses through the windows, so to speak, they can hint at a larger truth. In my case, finding an account of treaty discussions that were notable for how much mead were consumed or how honey was a part of feudal tithes, those little pieces were able to help me expand on my assertion about the ability for there to be a robust honey-producing economy in this area by virtue of, if it can produce this much mead and it can have this much tax, then this is something that I can assert, which I'm not going to go into the full scope of my projects here, but that was very important indeed. And so whether it's from resources like my Rus sources or trade manifests or court and palace records, or, for example, legal decrees that prohibit the use of certain objects by certain classes, such as, Italian sumptuary laws come to mind for me. These documents can allow you to have sort of looking backwards perspectives. I can let you pursue different avenues and help inform those avenues in your research. That said, going back to our house metaphor, Just because you live next to your neighbors doesn't necessarily mean you manage or decorate your house exactly the same. It's really important that if you use those outside sources, you do not overgeneralize. For example, going back to our discussion of Poland, Lithuania, maybe you want to write a research paper. You want to talk about the objects or the dress or the different, I don't know, some aspect of life in Warsaw, in Poland, Lithuania, in the 1600s. You want to maybe discuss the rising middle class. Off the top of that statement, the rising middle class in Warsaw of the 1600s. That's a broad category, right? And you can make generalizations about the quote-unquote rising middle class, but that includes merchants, it includes guildsmen, it includes bankers, it includes a number of professions all at once, and that's a very large swath of very different people, to say nothing of considering whether or not those of the middle class were Christian or Jewish. Generalization can indeed be a useful tool when keeping your discussion, topical, so to speak, but it can also be terribly reductive and a sort of like hand wave of sameness. Like that hand wave of rising middle class covered all those different professions and completely, glossed over a major cultural difference that is underpinned beneath that generalization of religion. And while I'm incredibly fond of my sources and research, which quite frankly have been water in the desert in some cases, but I would give you the severe caveat: if you're going to use the perspectives I outlined in the previous slide and have continued here, you must not overextend your conjectures, as it's the easiest way to discredit your own research. So, for example, going back to the discussion of Warsaw, if someone were to present me with a project for judging, which I have been a judge a couple times now, and they presented this sort of overarching generalization of the rising middle class and then presumed their entire research paper off of that initial generalization, I would immediately look to see if they at all gave a head nod or an acknowledgement to the Jewish or Christian populations, or if they at all broke down their generalization to say, I know this is an overreach, or I know this is a wild generalization, but for this case, I am not discussing about this population with regards to X, Y, and Z, only for Q. That sort of statement can cover, but if that sort of thing isn't there, for me, that would essentially invalidate their conclusions from the get-go, because they are making a generalization and a comparison that is too broad. And so I caution you then to describe the entire house through those window glimpses. You have to contextualize responsibly here. And this goes for the SCA as well as my professional work. There has to be a firm line in your research between that which can be construed and that which is completely conjecture. So with regards to this, with regards to this fourth and final set of questioning, another note hiccup. So as we are evaluating these different stances to take, consider too that when you're going through your research and maybe you're struggling because you found yourself in a space where your line of thought no longer has support or evidence, in this situation, it is very probably that, it's very possible that you have overreached and you need to check back to firmer grounds of evidence. And this is what our fourth set can assist with. It is essentially a theoretical Occam's razor, which, if you're not familiar with, it states that the simplest explanation is likely the most true. In this discussion, we've talked a lot about questions that we can and should ask of people and objects, but there is a point where we've reached questions that we can't and shouldn't ask. We started touching upon this in the previous slide. Consider then this image of this knight fighting the snail, and all of the ways that we thought we could address an object or address an image, right? So there's really a lot of that we could suppose about this knight, and a lot that we could suppose about his snail-based motivations, as well as the person who drew, this knight fighting a snail. But truth be told, unless it is written out somewhere explicitly for us to understand, we have absolutely no evidence for any of those suppositions other than the person drew this knight and snail because it pleased them to do so. To say anything else without further evidence would be overreach. And you guys might be thinking this sounds a little silly because of course we wouldn't try to imagine, an anti-snail-based religion of the knight, or the gendered motivations of why this knight is fighting this snail. But arguments based on premises like these are not uncommon in academia. And this idea of people, yelling at each other because they suppose that the knight has this kind of anti-snail religion versus another camp that thinks it has this kind of anti-snail justification that's economic. This kind of people yelling at each other while out on equally flimsy limbs is ultimately entirely futile, because either of these camps can be equally disproven. And ultimately, if you find yourself arguing on that camp and you're like, I think it's true, but you don't know if it's true, it is far better to correct back to what you can actually say rather than to die on that kind of hill of supposition. All this considering, though, if we're talking about checking back on our suppositions, it sounds kind of easy and it sounds like it's not work. But consider it when you hit the point where you consider that maybe you're on the wrong tack, it can be quite difficult. It is the nature of rabbit holes that we do not see how far we have gone down them until we hit the very end. Perhaps over this course of this talk, you have realized you have hit a spot like this in your own research, and you may ask, Lord Cass, how do I get out of this? You have a point, but I'm very deep in the weeds. And oddly enough, Freud can help us here in remembering that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the most true. And you may look at these pages you've written or the research you've done and you've spent time on this and you realize, maybe the simplest explanation is the most true, and this is all a lot of work for not something I can really have stand up on its own two legs. And you might freeze because you realize it is not of use. And now you're looking at all this work you've done and you're wondering what to do with it. And it's here that I want to talk about sunk cost fallacy and how it can really take a toll on whether or not you complete a project or redirect it or consign it to the bin of the unfinished things. Sunk cost fallacy, like imposter syndrome, where you don't believe you know enough and should never speak up, is one of the biggest liars in research. And what sunk cost fallacy states is that because you've put a lot of effort into something, it means it has to be worthwhile and you have to keep doing it. And it can be truly painful to realize that you've put so much work into something and now you have to delete it. And it may feel like you've wasted all that time. But ultimately, there really is no true waste of time in any research endeavor. There is no arbitrary figure that decides for you when the appropriate time is to learn something or the amount of time it takes. And there's no arbitrary figure to decide the appropriate direction your research should take. And I believe that understanding this is one of the hardest skills to pick up en route to mastery. And the agency of how you value your own time and your own direction is bundled in with it. It is here you have to be able to look at the totality of your project, your art, if you will, and erase it. And, I'm going to borrow again from my wife here, as she works professionally as an artist and a graphic designer, and she says it best. Ultimately, she states, if the piece you are working on does not serve the purpose of its creation, whether based on what a client asks for or what you want to get out of the project, the joy of your own joy of creating it, then it's failing. And you can't be precious with it, she says, in either the time spent on it or hyper-focusing so hard to get it perfect. And with your research, if you're at the point where you're like, this isn't making me happy, it's not bringing me joy, these aren't the things that I want to do anymore. And, if your documentation's off in the weeds and you feel like you're chasing a loose end, or you don't know where it'll turn up, then you have to be able to recognize it and cut back. I did it with this very PowerPoint. The first version was way too jargon-filled and way too academic, and it took some very harsh and direct but very true criticism from a respected friend to help me see that. And true, it was hard to take and harder to do, but ultimately I erased this entire PowerPoint and started from scratch. And I'm very, you may have different opinions as you, the viewer, but I, as the maker, I'm pretty proud of this PowerPoint, and I'm much happier with the end product. And, if that's the walking example, the sum of it here is that when you're deep in the weeds and you need to see a way out, your best tool is a weed whacker, not necessarily a better pair of binoculars. Ultimately, if we're wrapping up now towards the end, and if we're looking for the essential question of this PowerPoint, these sets of questions are like facets on a die. Each spot that you can roll and land on will show you a new number, right? Or a new perspective to consider. And when you're looking at these sets of questions, what do these sets of questions want you to look at when you're considering your arts and sciences project? What lenses do they want you to consider? What do they want you to look at, right? And what can you say then, using these different perspectives, about the object in its time or the people who created it? All of these are facets of a die for you to use in your documentation. And so we've considered all these questions now with smaller objects. Now let's look at a single artifact and let's see what we might be able to consider. And so I want you to consider this weasel head. And now that we're presented with this bejeweled weasel head, right? What questions can we ask of it? Like, what can we see in the art style that tells us about the religion or the culture creating it? Can we tell something about the people who made it in terms of the skill, their access to enameling, their access to the gems, perhaps in the fineness of the gold working and the tooling? What can we say about the cost of the object and who might purchase it? True too, what can we say about the person who would buy and display this bejeweled weasel head, if we can say anything at all? And you may be a little miffed here at this, having this sort of random object being put at you, and now I'm like, here, ask these questions, try to figure out what you can figure out, like it's some oracle of research, but there is a real purpose here. In your research journey, you will encounter many new sources, new objects, and new perspectives. The ability to call the suite of questions to mind when something really piques your interest is a very excellent skill for plotting a roadmap and how to learn about something new for your own research. Now, this is, we do actually know what this is. It is a head for a Zibolino, which is an Italian, English, late period fertility weasel that helps with the bearing of children, allegedly. You can see pictures of it in certain paintings during the Elizabethan period, as well as towards the end of the 16th century in Italian portraiture, if you want to look up anything further. So the final point I want to leave you with pertains to judging. More often recently, I've been called on to judge projects or stand in as a mentor. And indeed, many researchers many researchers such as you may be asked to judge, especially as you achieve specialties in knowledge, if you haven't yet already. This class should also be of great assistance to you with judging and research, as the questions you learn to ask of your own projects are easily applied to the judging of others, especially in giving helpful and constructive critique. This class is named for a critique I received early in my SCA career, actually. You need to flesh this out, you need to bulk this up more. And that was it. That's the sum of the critique. I know several folks in my own kingdom and more locally to me in my shire who have received this critique, and ultimately it is super unhelpful and very disheartening, as it is critical without direction, and all critique should strive to offer a constructive avenue to pursue. Many of these question sets can be used as a way to help others in direct feedback, and they should be of better use for articulating where a project can do better. And assuredly, we do not want to write paragraphs or overwhelm the person, but it is very easy to say, hey, why not try developing your background on the artist, or consider the makers of this object in this method, or consider who might have purchased this. And that way you might be, and that is a much more constructive avenue that has direction than just to, flesh it out more. So throughout this presentation, I have called these lines of inquiry, quote unquote, question sets. And I have done so for a reason. Theory can be really intimidating, and I really don't want to vomit jargon at you. And there was a lot of wool in my head when I first encountered a lot of this. That said, if you want to look up more about these topics, these sets do have names. Our first set was a discussion about structuralism versus post-structuralism. So, the structures that create the objects versus the objects themselves. Set 2 is processualism combined with post-processualism, so another dueling pair of use versus people. Set 3, we talked about how to responsibly contextualize and use outside lenses to gain glimpses, and that is called textual meta-analysis. In our fourth set, the Occam's razor set and discussion is one of the aspects of postmodernism. To become self-aware of your own project and be able to look at it beyond what you want and critique it from there. And postmodernism is a very large and overarching set of theories, and there are many applications. I have given a way that it can be applied here that I think is more appropriate to the SCA, and I will give you a warning regarding postmodernism if you look it up further. It is a long and widely applied history and can be pretty crunchy to try to bite down and get an understanding on. Regarding resources, I actually would recommend first starting with the Wikipedia pages of each of the theories I gave you in the previous slide. I can confirm they are well cited and will give you good overviews about the development of each theory and the people who contributed most to them. If you want to dig deeper or have a specific, or maybe get into a more in-depth academic source, all of these on the slide are good resources. That said, I would most suggest those by Bruce Trigger. We do a lot of casual archaeology in the SCA, and clever eyes may have noticed from previous slides that I have selected heavily from archaeological theory for this class. And, that is for good reason. We've talked a bit about, to this point, about how to recreate an artifact just to understand it in totality. And that is ultimately, I think, a point that archaeological theory helps with best. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And kind of ignore this slide. I've repurposed this PowerPoint for a couple of events now. But in any respect, if you have any questions, this is posted in a number of places, but more specifically my YouTube channel, which through comment or through reference you can reach me through. So